Hey friends, I want to present an argument to you for why the new heavens and new earth and the millennium both start at the same time. Okay, so this is actually going to be real easy to follow, and I think it's a very powerful argument. Okay, so chapter 20 of Revelation, the first 3 verses talking about the angel binding Satan for 1,000 years in the bottomless pit, and afterwards him being released for a little season, right? Verse 4 says, "And I saw thrones, and those that sat upon them," and it describes them reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, right? Well, notice that what we did in verse 4 is that we backed up, because verse 3 ended with the little season, right? Then verse 4 starts, he sees thrones. Would anybody object to the idea of backing up to the beginning of the millennium in verse 4, so that when he sees the thrones, this is the same time that the devil is bound? Would anybody say, no, you have to wait till after the little season is up? In verse 3, you have to wait for after the little season at least to start before you can have the thrones. Nobody's going to object to that. The premillennialists are not going to object to that. The amillennialists are not going to object to backing up. And the postmillennialists are not going to object to backing up. And then verse 4 through verse 10 is describing that same period that we talked about in verse 1 through 3. In other words, you don't have 2 millenniums. You don't have verse 1 through 3's millennium and then verse 4 through 10's millennium. You just have him backing up in verse 4 to the beginning of the millennium again, right? So he's just describing the millennium 2 different times. Not 2 millenniums, 2 descriptions of the same period of time. Now we get to verse 10 and we talk about the end of the little season and Satan being thrown into the lake of fire, right? Verse 11, what do we have? "And I saw a great white throne." Everybody says, okay, and that's of course after the millennium's over, because we just talked about Satan being thrown in the lake of fire, and now he's moving on to the time after the little season, the great white throne, judgment, okay? But wait a minute. What did we do back in verse 4? We just finished the little season in verse 3, and we backed up to describe the thrones that the saints sit on. Now we get over to verse 11. We just finished up the little season again in verse 10, and now we're talking about thrones again. We're talking about a great white throne. Why can't we back up just like we did in verse 4? Why can't we? So, in fact, if you applied the same, if you do the same thing that you're doing in verse 10 and 11, if you do that same thing, make it all chronological and not back up, if you did that same thing back in 3 and 4, you get the absurdity of 2 millenniums. The text forces you to back up. I mean, just the fact that it's repeating the same kinds of events in verses 4 through 10, it's repeating the same storyline practically as in verse 1 through 3, forces the reader to back up in verse 4. But he's giving you the clue to how to understand verse 11. Just like you backed up in verse 4 when he starts describing the thrones of the saints, same thing in verse 11. You back up to the beginning of the millennium again, and that's the great white throne. So the same thing you do in verse 4, you do in verse 11. You back up to the beginning of the millennium. It's that simple, and that's how you get the new heavens and the new earth starting at the same time as the millennium. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to you. Hope you'll consider that, look at it, and notice that, little season, thrones. Little season, thrones in both of the 2 cases. And they're the same thing. They're backing up to the same starting point, to the beginning of the millennium, in verse 4 and in verse 11. Until next time, God bless you.